Hello everybody. The 11th of September holds a special name in the English language. It is called 9/11. We know this because there was a huge tragedy befalling the free world on this date. The event opened the doors for far-right policies, extended racism and significant reductions of civil rights, and it would shape the history of Chile for decades to come. Wait, Chile? Yeah, Chile. I'm not talking about 9/11 2001. I'm talking about 9/11 1973, an often overlooked date in the Western world. Doesn't even show up in most history books. It marks the day on which the democratically elected president of Chile was overthrown by the far-right regime of Augusto Pinochet, who would go on to brutally kill and torture tens of thousands of people while being supported by the United States of America. Now, you may wonder why America during the Cold War would support overthrowing a democratically elected leader in Latin America. No, you don't. It's because he was a Marxist. That's the reason. The people elected a leftist, so the Americans supported a coup by a man who would commit incredible crimes against humanity. We will talk about the government of Salvador Allende, the coup on the 11th of September, the regime of Pinochet and its crimes. But first, a shockingly short summary of the history of Chile. The area that would become Chile was populated ever since 10,000 years ago, and there were many native peoples living in the area. Sadly, in the grand tradition of white Europeans talking about history, they will be entirely ignored today. Around 1500, the Spanish conquistadors began taking over parts of the American continent. Even though there was no gold to be found in Chile, they still set up a regime because of the rich agricultural land in the region, and later they found copper as well. From this onward, Chile was a colony, like all of the Americas was. Eventually, by 1818, Chile gained its independence and Spain was no longer able to resist because the Iberian Peninsula was conquered by a Frenchman who was average height for the time. Chile would then go through many governments and even fought a war to get larger. Eventually, by 1925, there was reform towards a presidential system, which just means that the president leads the country. Which of course led to the eventual election that put Salvador Allende into power. He led the Popular Unity movement, which united socialists, communists and social democrats. Because the election was three-way, Allende won with a 36% of the popular vote. Of course, the two largest candidates had a popular election to reach candidate who gets the actual majority. That was of course the Popular Unity movement. Allende announced the country would take the Chilean way to socialism. This tells us that he was not strictly a Soviet socialist and relied more on adapting to the conditions of his country, similar to Mao and other third worldist ideologies. His platform included many interesting things like, for example, nationalizing the vital copper industry, along with state-critical industries which had been owned by American business people before. He also nationalized the healthcare system to provide care for everyone and engaged in some exciting land reform, taking land from landowners and giving it to the farmers that actually farmed the land. Of course, there was opposition to this, notably by the landowners, the far right, and some people in the middle class. But broadly, the government was supported by most. Allende, at his core, was a reformist who wanted to use the democratic system to reach socialism. This was criticized by the Marxist-Leninists, who wanted to abolish the democracy in favor of democratic centralism similar to the USSR, and from the other side many radical socialists wanted to destroy capitalism. I am quoting Wikipedia now. The radical leftist wing of the Socialist Party wanted to smash the capitalist system at once, even if that meant violent actions. Which is a sentiment I encounter a lot on the official Wiki 1999 Patreon Discord server, which you can join if you donate €5 to my Patreon. So you may wonder how it worked out in the end. Reform is good and all, but what were the results? Well, at the 1-year mark of Allende's presidency, they had a look. Compared to the governments before, they had developed the industry, which caused the GDP per capita to rise by 17% within just 1 year. He also reduced inflation at the same time. You know GDP and inflation are good and all, but I'm sure you as an attentive socialist know that GDP doesn't tell you about the quality of life of the people. So how are they doing? Well, unemployment was reduced, income was regulated to leave less of a gap between rich and poor, and the people consumed more things. This is evidence that the people had more money, so they spent more money, so they could buy nice new things for themselves. I may be radical, but I think increased consumption is good, because it means that more people enjoy the fruits of the industrialized economy. At the time, of course, Chile was still largely agricultural, but still. The government also increased wages and reduced taxes and provided free things which are of high importance, like food. The government also expanded state insurance to self-employed people, which is amazing because it's been 50 years and we still don't have that in Austria. I know because this channel makes me self-employed. The government also increased pensions for widows, invalids, orphans and the elderly. Truly, the horrors of communism. He also gave free milk to school children, half a litre a day, every day. The state also provided employment for the poorest, either in the newly state-owned industry or in public works projects. But the capitalists have been sitting in the back of the class with raised hands for long enough now. So let's answer the burning question of how did they pay for all of this? Which is the most common question people ask about socialist countries. Well, they got it from the industry they had collectivized. All these industries that in the past sent their profits to rich Americans were now giving money to the government itself. But such radical changes never go over easy, so there were issues. The GDP increased in the first year and then decreased the next two. This is largely because of the price of copper on the free market just dropped, and Chile was reliant on the copper mines for much of its income. Part of it was also Chile's inflation problem. The previous governments were unable to fight the rampant inflation, so Allende inherited a 35% inflation rate, which is crippling for any economy. He managed to reduce inflation in the first year, but it would plague him for the whole presidency. Because of the inflation, the country had problems. The industry was less productive than planned, which meant Chile was spending too much money. At the same time, people's real wages decreased. They had been given wage increases, but inflation meant that overall, people, especially the middle class, were worse off at the end of his presidency compared to the start. On top of that, because of the economic decline and inflation, productivity was lowered across the economy, which led to shortages of basic commodities, so black markets sprung up. Allende also worked on Project Cybersyn, which was a way to plan the economy of the country using a shockingly new technology called computers. The software would simulate the entire economy to aid workers with planning the economy. This is notable because it is the only example of real-world computer-planned economics. AI-planned economies are still a common talking point among the left, but ultimately the system never got used to its full potential. Allende tried to establish some austerity measures to try to reduce spending, but it did not work. Despite that, in early 1973, the Popular Unity Party increased its political control after the election. But the coalition they used earlier fell apart, and the other parties, among them nationalists, unified into what they called the Confederation for Democracy. In the end, the Popular Unity government lacked the votes to take charge of parliament. This caused a massive split, because the socialist president no longer had the means to do anything, which meant the government was kind of useless, and a lot of people protested. What didn't help was that Richard Nixon immediately placed embargoes on Chile because communism is bad. The military in Chile at the time was depoliticized, which means soldiers and generals could not be politicians. This happened against the backdrop of 5 different Latin American nations being overthrown by military coups within just the previous decade. The side effect of this was that the military was underfunded and not very happy with the government. This plus American propaganda meant a coup was inevitable. The first thing to happen was that a colonel showed up to the president's house with the tank battalion. That went nowhere, and it was legit just one guy and his battalion. This was not part of a larger thing. Then there was a crisis. You see, the High Court officially said that the president, who's the head of the executive, is not enforcing the laws properly. The Chamber of Deputies, aka Parliament, decided that crisis is great, so they also officially declared Allende incompetent, and while they were at it, called upon the military to bring back order. I don't see how that could go wrong at all. At the same time, loads of people were protesting against the government to complain about food prices. Remember, there was quite the inflation at the time. Allende did as the parliament had said and tried to enforce the law by tear-gassing protesters. Well, he wasn't a saint, that's sure. The parliament then called upon everyone, including the military, to protect the constitution And what they meant was to oppose Allende, because they accused him of wanting to establish an authoritarian system, which is ironic, because an authoritarian system was about to be established, but not by Allende. Allende replied by calling out Congress for trying to muddy the waters and establishing a military junta. Also, the parliament did not even have the votes needed to convict the president of anything. Basically, they just said, remove him without a legal reason. Allende then said that his rule was the most democratic Chile had ever been, which is curious because he and parliament didn't work together at all by this point. He then called upon all workers and Democrats and patriots to join him in the revolutionary process. And now, finally, the 11th of September arrived. The first thing to happen was that the Navy mutinied. Then the Army would disable and take all radio and television stations. The Air Force bombed the ones the Army could not take. This was to prevent Allende from coordinating opposition. The entire army was in rebellion against the president. Only some police forces joined the president in the presidential palace. By 9 a.m., the military had announced their full takeover of Chile, and that the president must resign. Not sure how they announced it, considering they blew up all the radio stations, but sure. At this point, the whole country, besides the city center of Santiago, was under military control. The coup only took a few hours. The military called on the president to resign, and if he won't, they would bomb his house. There was an idea to move him from the presidential palace to southern Santiago, where there were many workers who supported him. Remember, his party had 42% of the votes, but he declined that idea. Ultimately, he gave a farewell speech to those who would listen, and as the military approached the palace, there were reports that the president killed himself. Other reports say that he died fighting, but the military says it was a suicide. And the gun he used was actually gifted to him by Fidel Castro. They were friends, apparently. Allende most likely did this because he saw no way out that did not involve being tortured and executed. In total, Allende's government only lasted 3 years before being overthrown. Of course, this would not be a Latin American coup d'etat without the CIA. They had extensively supported the development of a coup against the socialist government the day it was elected, which the CIA called Track 2. The US government also donated weapons and military support to the future junta, and they gave many large donations to anyone who opposed Allende, be they Christian conservatives or literal nationalists that wanted to execute all leftists. The US President and Henry Kissinger discussed their support for a coup, and even the missiles fired at the presidential palace were donated by the United States of America. In total, the coup left tens of thousands of people dead, almost all of them socialists. Turned out that Augusto Pinochet, the leader of the coup and new ruler, was quite fascistic in the way he would rule. The first action Pinochet took was what would later be called politicide or political genocide. He and the regime were brutal in the way they dealt with suspected leftists. Sometimes they were thrown out of helicopters as execution. The Pinochet government did not care about the rule of law. They just arrested people they suspected of being the enemy, and an estimated 30,000 people were brutally incarcerated and tortured by the regime, with torture methods that would be too brutal to describe on YouTube without getting a channel strike. In the early years, the regime killed thousands of people, though officially they were ruled as disappearing. Records show that most disappeared were killed. Leftist militias tried setting up resistance, but they had many casualties and no good leadership. Maybe with Allende they would have a better chance, but he chose another way. Over 200,000 people experienced significant trauma such as PTSD because of the actions the junta took. And in total, because of the regime, 200,000 people left the country. That's 2% of the country just leaving. Others were forcibly exiled. Pinochet can be declared equal to the worst dictators of the 20th century. He was truly the Hitler of Chile. Let's now look at his economic policies to see if he was less bad there. Immediately after the coup, no economic changes were made because the junta had nobody who knew economics. So they invited US-educated economists called the Chicago Boys. They advised neoliberal, laissez-faire, free market capitalism and fiscal conservatism. If you don't know what that means, they basically tried to let the free market do whatever it wants and to cut government spending. In response, the Chilean economy collapsed because of a debt crisis which spiked unemployment to 20%. That's almost as bad as the Great Depression was. And yes, inflation was still rampant, so those people protesting Allende for not providing commodities were now starving. But when they protested, they were arrested and tortured, so they did not complain. They were still starving. They just pretended to be happy. When Pinochet noticed that his economic policies are awful, he took a page out of Allende's book and nationalized core industries. Most notably the copper industry, which was never privatized because Pinochet found it too important. But he did privatize the government pension system, healthcare and schools. No need to tell you that school children no longer got free milk. And neither did starving people get free food. Then the junta decided to fix the currency exchange rate, which led to the Chilean economy collapsing entirely while relying on import. After which, a worldwide economic crisis happened, which led to Chile's GDP dropping by 14% and unemployment rising to 33%. That is worse than the Great Depression. It kind of seems like the neoliberal policies in charge were not the best for the Chilean people. This graph shows you the GDP under Pinochet. You can see it immediately goes down and is lower than the GDP of the rest of Latin America, until Pinochet was out of office. And here we see how unemployment went bad after Pinochet took power. All in all, people argue, but 20 to 30,000 people died. Hundreds of thousands left because of political persecution and economic ruin, and hundreds of thousands were permanently psychologically damaged. The justification for the coup was that Allende wanted to establish an authoritarian government. She was overthrown by one of the worst authoritarian regimes in the world at the time. All supported by the CIA and the American taxpayer, of course. All because Allende had the balls to call himself a socialist while ruling a Latin American country during the Cold War. Here's the thing. This guy, Gustavo Fring, the big bad guy in Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, was actually canonically a general in Pinochet's army. Yes, the most brilliant TV villain ever was canonically a war criminal in Pinochet's junta. Eventually, the rule of Pinochet came to sort of a peaceful end after 17 years, when his term as president ran out and the public vote whether he could be allowed to keep his position returned a no. So, a year later, a general election was called and Pinochet was replaced by a Christian Democratic candidate. So here's my question. Feel free to answer it in the comments. Have you ever heard about all this in school or on TV? Probably not. We all know 9/11/2001, but that only killed 3,000 people. Pinochet's junta killed 10 times that. Also, again, he was entirely supported by the US government. In conclusion, kind of fucked up, isn't it? Thank you for watching. Never forget September 11th, 73. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more subversive expectations and video titles. I would like to thank my patrons who make it possible for me to pay for healthcare and food while I spend all my time making YouTube videos. And especially thanks to my high-level patrons who are Theon Hartley, Alan Vo, Eric Betts, Nanel Pema, V, Xander Corvus, Tusnek, Attila Nemetz, Ben Harrison, Bottom Bitch Lena, Carissa, Daniel Hyman, Dominic Cusanelli, Emily Margot Klassen, Herdina, Ian Snyder, Jane, The Mentalist, Kevin Sanders, Klastrup, Lazy Pounder 234, Liam S, Raymond DeVille, Red Shirt Trooper, Sarah, Sean Murphy, Stairmaster Chef, Theon Gilliland Jr., The Swiss Femboy, Travis and Yamil.